Welcome to Perfectly Frank. Today I have Matthew Green. He is the NDP representative for Hamilton Center. Why don't you introduce yourself?
What's going on to everybody out there in Frank's world? My name is Matthew Green, the very proud member of Parliament and New Democrat right here from Hamilton Center. I also happen to be the party's Labour critic, so the Labour critic in Canada's only Labour Party, as well as the critic for employment and workplace development. So what a time to be those roles, and certainly look forward to the chat tonight, Frank. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for being here. The one thing that I kind of wanted to start with is I feel as though a lot of people, when they think about the NDP, depending on where they live, it's either like, yeah, until I die, or it's something that they completely brush off. That being said, I don't think that that's really a fair way to view politics in general, like whether it's the Greens, whether it's the NDP, or even, unfortunately, whether it's the PPC. I really, really think that we have to start at like a people-centric view first, figure out why people support the parties that they support and why they would run in the first place. So you were not a provincial or a federal member of parliament first. That was not your first political venture, was it not? No.
No, like you're quite right. First off, I think that the average Canadian, feels politically estranged. They don't feel like they're part of the process. They feel like politics is simply voting and then kind of being shut out for the remainder of the 3 or 4 years in between. And like many people, I didn't actually see myself reflected in party politics or see my values closely aligned in party politics, which is why when I started right here in Hamilton in Ward 3 at the municipal level as a city councillor, somebody who came back to Hamilton kind of after, the 80s and 90s were pretty rough when I was growing up. People got as far away as they could. And then, in the 2000s and after, we had a lot of boomerang kids come back. A lot of kids I grew up with raised their family here. I was definitely one of those people. And, I saw decisions that were being made in my city that I didn't think were in the best interests of my family or my neighbors or my neighborhoods. And I'm not much of an armchair guy, so I decided to get in the game and run municipally. And in municipal government in Ontario, as you know, there's no parties in theory, although I ran against the Liberal machine, Sheila Copse's remnants of the Liberal machine. I ran against the NDP's candidates, right? Like the truth is I ran from outside of the party framework. And, in Hamilton Center, there isn't much of a conservative movement to speak of, but ultimately I ran as an independent and I did the nitty gritty, door to door, street to street, neighborhood to neighborhood, and was able to be elected in 2014 as a city councillor and the first person of African Canadian descent and first person of color really on city council. So that was where I got my start. And I thought here's a place where I could really help improve people's material conditions, which has always been my mandate. And what I realized is that much of what cities are blamed for are the symptoms of bad provincial and federal policy.
Well, the provincial government wants to control everything. I mean, Toronto is facing that. And I was talking to Councillor Matlow in Toronto about like how the city basically needs a bit more independence and how the province is really kind of dipping its hands into things or shows into things it doesn't belong in. But you're right. People want to see things solved at the municipal level, and either the municipal government doesn't have the tools, doesn't have the funds, or otherwise get to blame things. It's not their fault. And so I guess, is that part of why you jumped from the municipal to the provincial level? Or, federal level?
Yeah, I mean, look, some of the most haunting calls I would get were from people who I knew were facing imminent homelessness. They're calling me as a city councilor as the last resort. I'm working with them to try to find housing, try to find a shelter, sometimes trying to get them put up in hotels. And I realized I could take 100 of those calls a day, and the next day I'd have 100 more. Because like you identified, the funding mechanisms in municipalities, particularly when it comes to basic levels of need in terms of housing, the economy and so on and so forth, are way out of their power. And so when you look at how municipalities are funded, they're funded on two things. They're funded on tax assessments and building permits. Those two things are like the crack cocaine of gentrification. It forces municipalities to try to increase the property values to have a higher assessment, and it increases this corrupt ecosystem of developers kind of running the show for municipalities. Now, all of that is to say, Frank, that this is also the situation of having decades of downloading onto cities. So you're going to have your viewers out there who are going to be complaining about their property tax assessments, and sometimes they're going to be in the double digits. It's because cities were never set up to fund housing. Cities were never set up to deliver social services. Those are absolutely provincial and federal responsibilities. It so happens to be the case in Ontario. I will get partisan, politics are political, that we happen to have a premier who really wants to be the mayor of Ontario. This is a guy who comes from a legacy of municipal government. You know, he is definitely in the pockets of developers, or developers are in his pocket, depending on who you speak to. And the whole thing is about selling off every piece of public property that isn't nailed down and forcing municipalities to bend over backwards so that developers can come in and have their way. That's the Greenbelt corruption scandal. That's the downtown Toronto condo, malaise. That is the Ontario housing market in a nutshell.
And one thing that you kind of touch upon there, and I think for those who aren't aware, I believe you are on the borderline of being like a millennial and a Gen X, correct? Like you're kind of on that little.
I am a 1980s baby. I'm an exennial or whatever. It depends on who I'm talking to.
Yeah, I think that you really do fall into like the camp of the elder millennial, in so much that like the vibes you give off and the way that you talk and the way that you communicate, your ability to capitalize on different types of communication technologies and platforms. I would think that you're more like a millennial like myself. But that being said, we look at Doug Ford at the provincial level, and even at the federal level. Like Trudeau is very much in the weeds as a Gen Xer, and Pierre is around the same age as you, but the dude gives off serious boomer energy.
Yeah, that's an understatement for sure. This is a guy that has been practicing his speeches in the mirror since he was 14, right? Like his whole life has culminated around partisan.
All really he's wanted to do is be the prime minister.
That's right.
But the thing is, so the reason that I bring that up is not because I think that the generation that you're from is inherently important, but I do think that there is something to be said about the fact that people who grew up in the 80s and in the 90s, we saw things a little bit differently. We were told constantly about all the opportunities and how if we just do this, if we just do this, if we just do this, everything's gonna magically work out for us. But we also saw the end of that never-ending era of prosperity. We saw like 9/11 happened when I was in elementary school. And then I had to go through the 2008 crisis when I was in high school and university. And then I graduated into one of the lowest into the eras of the highest youth unemployment rates in Canadian history. So millennials have been constantly beaten down. And if you didn't take the plunge and buy a house as early as you possibly could, taking on that debt before you were ready, you got priced out of the market. So that is just to say, when I look at politics, one of the things that I feel is an issue is that regardless of age, a lot of the politicians, Doug, Trudeau, Pierre, they don't speak to the biggest voter bloc, which is now 28 to 45-year-olds. We are the largest working age population. We are the biggest taxpayers. And we are also the ones who are going to be bearing the brunt of the burden of the legacy of the Gen X and Boomer generations. So is there anything in terms of how you deal with politics or your views on the world that you think are unique to how you grew up in the 80s and in the 90s and how you came of age in that era?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good and important question. I don't come to my politics theoretically. It's not something I really spent a lot of time, contemplating when I was younger. But what I do know is I saw suffering. And in Hamilton, in so many ways, particularly looking at kind of where we're at now in this era of a dissolving free trade and an increasingly protectionist international economy. And, in Hamilton, my politics look like seeing people I know, care about, and live next to suffer from the flight of industrialization, the gutting of our local jobs, the flight of people from our urban cores, this kind of commercialization of every aspect of our lives, and I'm watching people suffer. And I think not only do older generations dismiss us, but they still, even into our 40s, even with all this gray hair, look at us as being kids, right? And not really worthy of serious consideration, when the truth is this was like a system of like a capitalist system of musical chairs. The music has stopped and they've pulled away all the fucking chairs. Like that's where we're at right now. And there's a whole generation who you quite rightly identified as being lied to. And I would say that is the essence of liberalism. The essence of liberalism, small L liberalism, is that you work hard. This is the mythology. You get a good education, you have a good job, you'll be able to take care of yourself and your family in a very small individualistic way. What Polyev has done is been able to find all the grievances of that. Like, he quite rightly identifies the grievance of capitalism, the rising costs of food, of rent, of unemployment, the food banks, but then he calls it socialism. In an absurd way, he calls it socialism, and rather than pinning this on, his corporate masters, what he does is he pins it on government, and he actively tries to attack the institutions of government, and I would argue in some ways democracy itself, and I think like this is the fundamental flaw of our democratic system. You talked about it earlier. Why people feel their votes don't count is because in a first past the post system, it is set up for Coke and Pepsi. And when you try to add in other choices, regardless of where they are on the political spectrum, you still have a scenario where a party can win 100% of the power with like 37, 38% of the votes. That's absurd.
God, that's like the Ontario vibe, isn't it? Just like
Yeah.
a small concentration of voters end up dictating 100% of the power for the majority of people. And you mentioned like Polyev and kind of how he's a master of using the language to create grievance politics. And one thing that I keep trying to explain to people is what he is doing is he is taking the issues that capitalism has created, ignoring the actual good parts of capitalism that we want to maintain in a social democratic system, and instead pointing at the worst parts of it and saying that's actually socialism.
That's right.
Well, it's socialism for the rich, capitalism for the poor, right? Like the about face and the absolute demonization without people understanding. Like, once again, you were talking small L liberalism. You have to clarify there, but the average person will point at something and say, "Oh, you're a liberal."
No, I'm a
Is
socialist.
that person liberal?
Yeah. I'm a straight up socialist, and I think it's important that even on that note, that we clarify that what we're seeing, at least from my perspective, isn't the rise of the far right. It is absolutely the collapse of liberalism. I say small L liberalism. In so many ways it applies to big L liberalism. Like, quite literally, there's a scenario where we could have a central banker as the Prime Minister of Canada. That is the essence of neoliberalism in all of its forms, right? And so it's very important to note that it's not necessarily socialism for the rich and capitalism for the rest of us. That is actually how capitalism works. Capitalism is absolutely designed to concentrate wealth in the fewest hands possible, and by design, in a winner-take-all economy, creates systems of cartels and oligarchies. We have 87 families who have more wealth than like the bottom half of this country. That is absurd. We do not have a democratic electoral system. We do not have a democratic economy, and we do not have democratic workplaces. These are all things that we can do that are within our control to improve the material conditions and insulate ourselves against the madness that is the world right now.
There was just because something you'd brought up about the concentration of wealth. There was a Broadbent Institute video from before the 2015 election, and it was talking about wealth concentration and all that, and how Canadians, regardless of political party, what they viewed the world as and what they wished the world would be like and what it actually was like. And what sucks is that I keep showing it in my econ class, but it's from 2014. And I keep having to say to the students, like, it's gotten worse since COVID. The concentration of wealth got so much worse. And now it's a 10-year-old video, and I wish that somebody, I've told them that they should recreate it, but I wish that somebody would recreate a similar one because it's a very useful tool. Because like in the Ontario curriculum, regardless of what political party is in power, the way that the curriculum has been worded is that when we teach economics, we don't teach, we teach that capitalism is the best way to create the most amount of wealth. But the wording in the curriculum is not that it is inherently the best system. And so what I teach to my kids is that we need a combination of every different system that is out there in order to create a world that does the most amount of good for the most amount of people. Because the curriculum says that the goal of the course in grade 12 is to find the ways to create a world that creates the most amount of benefit and happiness and wealth for the most amount of people. And so when the kids start, right? But when the kids start doing their research, they start saying, well, that sounds like socialism, but I like healthcare. That sounds like socialism, but I like this thing. Or that sounds like socialism, but it's in the best interest of the country for this specific industry. And so I really try not to lead them to those things because it's not for me to tell them
Sure.
that. But when the kids start doing their research, they do start seeing, oh yeah, like capitalism in the healthcare industry doesn't make sense, and that's why America is facing a lot of the problems that they're facing. Um, so like I want to bring it back to you though as an individual
Sure.
because we've all been radicalized by something, and the term radicalized, like when people talk about it on TikTok, it's kind of more like tongue in cheek. But like for me, I think what radicalized me in terms of coming to light more to be on the center left to the leftist side of the political spectrum was when I finally understood like Ray Days, when I finally understood what happened there, and my parents
Mhm.
explained to me that they would have lost their jobs if it wasn't for Ray Days, and when I keep seeing people complain about that, it doesn't make sense to me because I would not be able to do any of this. I would not be here who I am if it wasn't for the government making a hard decision at the time, which maybe people did not like at the time, but the government made a choice to keep people employed. And so that to me represented, yes, there does exist out there governments and politicians who are willing to do the hard work and do what's necessary to make citizens' lives better. So was there something for you, whether it was when you started on Hamilton City Council or when you moved up to the federal level, was there like a moment, either earlier in your life or later on, that like really kind of sparked that thing in you where you were like, oh my God, I truly believe, you said you call yourself a socialist. So kind of what was that like lighting spark that made you view socialism as like your guiding path?
It's just the inequalities. Like, I think the fundamental question that liberalism has failed to answer, and again, watching the collapse of liberalism, not the rise of the far right, is that liberalism is still elitist in so much as that it speaks the language of justice, but it never really addresses fundamentally the income inequalities that lead to disintegration of social cohesion. Like, I believe that if people are taken care of, and to be clear, like, when I talk about my vision of the future of the country, what I'm not trying to suggest is that we turn over into state capitalism where the government's running everything. I'm talking about those who create the wealth. So going back to your economics question, actually get to keep it. I'm talking about the workers who actually create the wealth having more of its share rather than it going to this pernicious, really kind of amorphous fractional reserve banking system where, during COVID, we can do bailouts of like $750 billion and then squabble over people getting $2,000 a month to get by on their basic needs. I know that there's enough wealth created in this country to take care of every single person living here, to give them quality housing, to give them world-class education and healthcare, to ensure their food needs are taken care of, their child needs are taken care of, their healthcare needs are taken care of, including mental health. I know that to be true. It's just a basic fact. The question is, we're choosing not to do it. And to me, when I pass by people in Hamilton who are living right now in minus 20 degrees, intense. Like, those are choices that are made. Well, simultaneously, we have record building permits year after year in Hamilton. So this isn't about the supply. This isn't about removing red tape. This is about being intentional about how society distributes its goods. So for me, in the 90s, going to the Ray Days, you talk about the Ray Days, but it was like Mike Harris gutted this city. Mike Harris gutted the social programs. He gutted education. He gutted healthcare. I remember being in the days of action and finding out what labor movements can look like when they have mass mobilization. Because they had like 100,000 people come to Hamilton when they had the conservative convention here with Mike Harris. So in a lot of ways, my father being an educator, my mother being a federal worker, growing up in a union household, understanding what solidarity looks like and collective action looks like, direct action looks like, it taught me where power is. And now, obviously, there's this dance again between Coke and Pepsi. In my estimation, under the Liberal government, it's a death by 1,000 cuts. They'll say the thing, they'll make the announcement, but ultimately we had 15 years in our healthcare and in our
If you see
education.
one step forward, you still see two or three steps back.
Yeah,
Like
and
the
if
progress doesn't get offset. Like
totally, and if the conservatives, if they're the death by 1,000 cuts, then with a scalpel, then the conservatives are the butcher block, and we're seeing that right now. They are butchering our public good. Everything that is in shared public ownership, whether it's looking at Ontario Place or the Science Center or like all of these places that we enjoy, our agricultural green belt, right? Our tender fruit, the things that give us sustenance with the farmers, they're selling it all off, right? And this is a problem. And again, for me, there's no need for anybody in this country to be homeless. You know, Frank, we built 1 million homes after World War II. So this idea that somehow we don't have a role to play federally in housing, that the markets are going to solve it. The markets got us into this mess.
Well, in the markets, when we had the highest rate of immigration in Canadian history, it was in the early 1900s. It was, I think, pre-World War I or around World War One. But the government had a big hand in building those homes. And I
Absolutely.
think that,
The Victory
yeah,
Home Project.
right. And so at the end of the day, whether or not somebody wants to scream socialism, this or socialism, that, if we talk about being effective and efficient, which I think when I try to reach conservatives, when I try to talk to them about these types of programs, I really try to sell them on the capitalist side of things, right? Let's think about the capitalist worldview being about maximizing profit, maximizing creation. Well, if you want to maximize creation and benefit, the government does have to have a hand in that. Why is that good for capitalism? Because that means that the person is not spending 90% of their income just to have a roof over their head. They have more disposable income because the house is being made affordable by the government. That person then goes out into your community. They're spending money at the local store. They're putting money back into the economy. That local business person's hiring another person. So I really do my best to try to spin it, to explain to people, like, there are capital benefits to having social programs.
This is my thought on this. I'll push back a little bit. Like, I don't think people wake up and say, gosh darn it, I'm a capitalist. Like, at the end of the day, if you're borrowing money, I got news for you. You're not a capitalist. If you are cashing a paycheck, you are not a capitalist, right? If you are paying interest and not collecting interest, you are not a capitalist. What I think, like the breakthroughs that I have with people who think ideologically or identify as conservative, I talk a lot about fairness. You know, I use the parable of the carpenter, that about 10 years ago, a master carpenter in Ontario made $42 an hour. The average house they built was $300,000 to $350,000 a home, right? That's a tradesperson on the job, building wealth, building value. You fast forward to now, that master carpenter is making $49 an hour, and that same house that they're framing and building is going for $750,000. Where did the money go?
$1 million or more. It's
The
insane.
value is not going to the people who create it. And I think when the average Canadian, I don't care who they identify, because I could go to rural Saskatchewan and I can ask them in a small town, if your neighbor's farm burnt down to the ground, would you make sure that they had food on their table? Would you help them rebuild the barn? 99% of Canadians across the country would say absolutely.
Because that's what Canada is.
Yeah, that's what we aspire to be. It's not what we are now. The truth is, it's not what we are now, because we've been captured. There's been a corporate capture of our public good. But I think aspirationally, regardless of how people identify along partisan lines, if we speak about the values of Canada in an aspirational way and call them into something greater than simply looking out for themselves, we don't have to talk about socialism. I think most Canadians would agree having a cooperative economy that takes care of one another. You mentioned the microeconomics of it, being able to go to the local store, buy from the local grocer, the local baker, do those things. I guarantee you the vast majority of Canadians would identify with that future, and they would say that's what we want. In fact, I think in a lot of ways, the nostalgia, the right-wing populism, this kind of like, whether it's Trumpist
or all that kind of stuff.
Well, no, this idea of going back to a better time does draw on these values of a shared collective responsibility, even if they bastardize it with this kind of everyman zero-sum.
Because it's about community. It's about, and so you were talking about like seeing the power of collective labor, right? I've got to say, like, as somebody who grew up in a union household, as somebody who was in a union and who talks about like the benefits of a union, simply because like the more workers that are unionized, typically the better off the average employee is, the higher the average income is. So like, just even if you're not unionized, there's benefits to unionization. But as somebody who is so in the weeds on the union side of things, I never felt inspired to be part of a union until Doug was about to use a notwithstanding clause to override our charter rights. And there was a hot second where we were an inch away from a general strike.
Yeah.
And it's a good thing it didn't happen, because that would have been catastrophic. But part of me wishes that Doug had gone through with it only so that people could see the power of organized labor. We were inches away from showing the government and showing people in positions of power that the real power lies with the people and with the work that gets done by those people.
No, what you say it'd be catastrophic if there was a general strike. Catastrophic for who?
Well, I'm just talking about like general work stoppages, right? Like you're going to start to see some discomforts occur. If it lasts a long time, it probably wouldn't last too long because the government would learn pretty quickly that they can't run a society without the workers in that society.
Yeah, I think the whole ruse of this abysmal system that we have is to make people think they have no power, right? But the truth is, I've done the Wizard of Oz. I've gone down the yellow brick road. I've pulled back the veil, and I've seen the tiny man behind the curtain. The truth is that people have tremendous power in collective action. I think, like as a politician, I would never. It's not my role to call for general strikes as a direct action. It has to come from workers in the working class. But I do know this, like you asked about being radicalized. We were able to use our power and deliver on dental care. And people say, like, so what? It was, I already have dental care. Like, I would actually hear this from people with unions. They'd say, I already have dental care. Like, very much in Hamilton, your smile is your first class indicator. The kids who didn't get braces, right? The kids, the seniors who never had a job that created benefits for them that allowed them to have dental care. You see it in the decay of their teeth, right? Like we should want for other people what we have for ourselves. So when you have politicians who've had pharmacare and dental care and a gold-plated pension, they have all these things and yet vote against those very things for other people. You got to ask yourself, like, what value? What moral, what ethic are they drawing from? And, for me in this moment, with an economy that is uncertain, I had an opportunity to meet with steel workers. Obviously, tariffs are going to be top of mind for anybody, this kind of Trumpist fascist creep that's coming up right now, that the unions are the front lines for protections. Because when there's economic uncertainty, the private sector is absolutely going to find efficiencies, which means what? Lower wages, suppressed wages, layoffs, bankruptcies and all these things in order to deliver for their shareholders rather than the people who create values, which are, once again, like in the Bueller, anyone, the workers. It is the workers who create the value in this country, not the banking group.
One of my students today was actually asking me, why is it that when companies either are about to be sold or when they're about to do a public offering, why do they do layoffs? Like this kid was, I guess, doing some reading or he was listening to a podcast or something. And it was kind of a funny question. And I'm like, yeah, man, it's because they're trying to make their balance books look better. They're trying to increase the value per share so that the amount of money per shareholder goes up. Because when we talk about like the drive behind capital, it is to accrue wealth and it is to concentrate it. And he's like, yeah, but isn't that bad for the business? And I'm like, yeah, a lot of the actions that we take in capitalism are antithetical to the concept of growth and to the concept of creating wealth, because what we're doing is we're cutting off our nose to spite our face.
Yeah.
And I think we see that in government too, right? Like balance the budget. We have to be responsible fiscally, this and this and that. And then like you get Doug Ford running larger deficits than anybody else in Ontario history. And even Pierre says, oh, I'm going to do dollar for dollar spending, dollar for dollar cuts. What, like, I understand the desire to be fiscally restrained, but a dollar for dollar approach seems like apocalyptic when it comes to services in Canada.
Oh, make no mistakes about it. Pierre Poilievre's his whole project is to dismantle government. Like it's rich for somebody who's been on the public, teat for as long as he has.
Pierre has been an MP since I was in elementary school. And yeah. I am starting to be told by my students that I'm no longer young. So I think we're getting to a point where Pierre is becoming ancient in terms of archaic in terms of Parliament.
Yeah, it's wild. And that is the grift. We're seeing it in a very clear way with Elon Musk in the States, our tech bros now, Shopify and others, people who would sell out our country in a heartbeat if it meant they would have higher shareholder value. They don't care about you. They don't care about us. They don't care about the everyday person. What they care about ultimately is the only religion that is universal for these people, which is the almighty dollar, right? And so for us, we believe that in this moment, of uncertainty, there is an opportunity to reimagine the economy, to shift towards that cooperative economy, to have a national industrial strategy where we're not only like shipping out raw materials, but we're building things here, we're refining things here, we're manufacturing things right here and creating jobs, good, well-paying union jobs that have good benefits. And, like we need to take the disruptions that are coming our way, whether we like them or not, and double down on making sure that we take care of the most vulnerable amongst us, right? Like that is, I think, our moral imperative, our ethical responsibility to deliver those things for people.
So when you talk about delivering for people, let's just say like magic fairy wand, poof, you could implement obviously whatever costs or issues come with it, like those would still exist, but you could make sure that Parliament passes a bill to enable a certain type of program. Like for me, one of the things that for years I'd always been kind of looking at was pharmacare, and now mental health care are the things that I look at thinking like, yeah, like these should be part of our holistic healthcare system. Is there a specific policy or program that you think to yourself, if I could just snap my fingers, this is the next thing that Canada needs right now?
Yeah, proportional representation. Like, I don't think any politician has the one answer, the one policy that is going to solve the social challenges that we're going to face, be it the climate disaster, war, the collapsing economy. But I do think collectively there is a wisdom in a true deep democracy that is deliberative, that engages people in between elections, that calls them into their civic duty. I think proportional representation does that when people know that their vote matters. It moves away from the wedge politics of first past the post. Like the truth is, if you have Coke or Pepsi, if you have the Liberals and Conservatives who sit at around 30% in a natural state, all they have to do is appeal to 8% of the population. And every election cycle, they choose which 8%. So
you just got to target millennials in the GTA, or you got to target people in Atlantic Canada, or Anglophone people in Quebec. Like you find your group, and if you can swing them, you swing the election.
Yeah, or far right, bigots. Like those are also wedge
people who don't normally vote, and you bring them in, and that's enough to sway some ridings.
No, they do normally vote. It's just a matter of which ones you pick and how the numbers work. And I think
enough.
Again, Canadians would be startled to even find out how few people decide who's on the ballot. Like if you were to do the math in a riding of 125,000 people and figure out how many members in each riding association determine who the candidates are, or worse, if there's appointments or if there's the central leadership team deciding who's on a ballot. Like, I think it's important for us to restore our civic duty to understand exactly how our systems work. The Westminster system as it's designed, very few Canadians know what that is. Like the notion, Frank, that cooperation is undemocratic is not just wrong, it's dangerous. It is a dangerous ideology and attack on democracy that parties can't from time to time cooperate in order to get things done in a Westminster system is super dangerous, and like is the tiptoe towards an authoritarian ideology in this country, that it's completely winner take all and that the prime minister has complete and total power. That's scary to me.
So I'm just gonna go a little bit more in the weeds on that before I pivot to something else. But if I was to lay before you PR or MMP, like is pure PR the way that you see this going, or is there value in the mixed member system?
Yeah, I think the mix, like for me, being a city councilor, maybe I'm being, a little bit parochial here, but I do think having an attachment to place is important, right? Like, I don't know that the best form of democracy is having parties decide who's on a list. Now, there would be internal, like, I think if we were to do democratic reform across the table, one of the things we would want to look at is the nomination process. Like, I would say, as much as we like to think we're better than the states and everything else, I actually like the idea of the nomination processes being out of the control of the party, and in particular leaderships, and being with Elections Ontario or Elections Canada.
Like a proper primary system.
Where they have the lists, and you're registered to vote, and you can vote for your party. And if you want to vote for another party, you have to demit and change officially, re-register as another member. What we have in our leadership races and in our nomination races are like 48-hour members. People who sign up a membership card to vote, and then they don't engage again. And so, like, to me, this is going to sound strange for people who aren't familiar with the term. I am a small r Republican. What I mean by that, I'm not in favor of the monarchy, but most importantly, I believe that every citizen should be playing an active role in the deliberative democracy of our country. And so when you have a prime minister who says it's going to be the last election under first past the post, and then jumps on a podcast to basically reveal that his biggest regret wasn't that he didn't deliver electoral reform. That wasn't what he said. His biggest regret was that he didn't impose the type of system that he wanted.
He really wanted that ranked ballot. He really wanted it.
Which is absurd, and again speaks to the elitism of liberalism, big L liberalism in this country, which gives us a fertile ground to right-wing populism, right? Like, there is an elitist air to the Liberal Party that is exclusive and exclusionary, and believes that those people at the top know best, right? I believe there's a collective wisdom in democracy based on the actual people and the will of the people. I don't mean tyranny of the majority. I do believe in the values of protecting people's individual rights as protected by the Charter, but as you identified through the notwithstanding, and now we have Pierre talking about doing it federally, that Charter should be so ingrained that you can't set it aside. It was never contemplated to be used proactively.
Well, right? and there's been a ramp up of the notwithstanding clause to the point where it was before unthinkable, and now Quebec retroactively applies it to every law. Ontario, Quebec, Ontario, Saskatchewan, Alberta, everybody's basically been like saying, "Oh yeah, sure, why not? Why wouldn't I get rid of your rights?"
That's right.
And so that is something that I'm concerned about. I do want to though pivot a bit to talking a bit more about you in Hamilton.
Sure.
And this does kind of relate to class. Hamilton is a unique city. For those who aren't aware, the city is almost split in half. And there are those who are at the top of the mountain on the other side of on the river and on the escarpment, and those who are closer into the city center. Do you think that the issues plaguing Hamilton are geographic, or are they more representative of like the same type of issues that you see with class and the removal of people intermingling from different social classes? Is that something that's a geographic issue, or is that more Canadian ingrained?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from Hamilton. I wouldn't say it's halves. I would say it's thirds. We have inner city urban. We have suburban, which you identified could be the mountain and some of the smaller outlying communities like Stony Creek and Dundas. But then we also have a huge rural population as well that often isn't associated with Hamilton. But the truth is we are nestled in the Greenbelt. We do have Flamborough, Glanbrook, Winona. We have a very,
Waterdown's part of your
Waterdown, yeah, which is increasingly becoming more suburban. But the point is that we also have that. And when I was coming up, you asked me about what radicalized me. I was on the Hamilton Community Foundation and the board there. And I remember we first introduced Code Red, which was a study by postal code about poverty in Hamilton. And at the time, we knew that there were postal codes in downtown Hamilton that had a life expectancy of 61 years, where in Flamborough and Waterdown, it was 81 years.
I was going to say that's a huge disparity. Like,
that's third world. That is deplorable. That is a deep shame that to this day we have some of the highest levels of child poverty. We're also 10, 15 years later, deeply impacted by gentrification. So when Toronto has a hiccup and people sell their home there, they're moving to Hamilton. We believe everybody, we welcome everybody. We don't, think that we don't look down on people who moved here, got priced out of their own neighborhoods. But the truth is that's had a residual effect. And so affordability, this used to be a city of last resort, quite frankly, and now it's like first choice for people. And there is a tension with the way in which somebody moves here from Toronto, buys a house, takes the equity out of their sale in Mississauga or Scarborough, wherever they're coming from. And then they come here and they're not used to being face to face with deep poverty. And so they get here and they're like, I want those people out of that park. I want that house shut down because it's got renters or vagrants or people who use drugs or whatever. And so that tension that we're seeing happen across the country has been happening here for the last 15 years. We are the canary in the coal mine. Now, the upside to this is that we are also a proud and strong community, a resilient community, one that I believe has endued me with the qualities of like looking after each other, right? And it's not a place of sympathy; it's a place of deep empathy. We know that those material conditions can happen to any of us, but the inequality here is stark, and there are lessons to be learned, particularly around what happened as a post-industrial reflection on NAFTA. So when all those jobs left, the prosperity left with it, and there was no response. Like to many people living in Hamilton, the jobs program was getting a pink slip at the factory and being told to go to a retraining program to learn how to code or some goddamn thing, right? Like there was no
that was never in their skill set. That was never in the cards for them.
Never. And they were completely disregarded in the 90s, right? People deeply suffered. And then we saw an uptick, and now I think times are going to get tough again for people.
Well, in Hamilton, maybe I'm wrong in making this comparison, but I think that Hamilton's maybe a few bad years away from being similar to a Detroit-style situation, simply where a lot of union, a lot of like steel is like the main industry, right? And if like I doubt anything happens to the steel industry, but God forbid something did, tough times would probably fall upon the city, right? Like they are a major employer.
I would say there's tough times now. Like I would say, I would have to acknowledge that people are suffering. Again, every time you turn around, there's a company who's trying to suppress wages. There's workers who are out, they're being laid off. There's mergers and acquisitions that happen where companies get shut down. It's tough. And yet, like, we're still here, right? And we're still proud. What we require in this moment of deep uncertainty is a government intervention and central planning that includes workers in the working class. That we cannot leave our economy up to bankers in the banking class, the CEO class of this country, Bay Street. We cannot afford to do that in times of uncertainty. That every decision should be tripartite. It should have the workers in the working class, government, and the private sector at a table, figuring out labor markets, figuring out how to make sure that temporary foreign workers have prevailing wages and are given the rights and benefits. And if they're good enough to work here, they're good enough to stay. They're not just used to flood the labor market. That international students are respected. And if they're here for legitimate purposes, that they're given pathways to citizenship, right? All of these things need to happen. But that planning will never happen unless the working class is actually at the table where decisions are made.
Well, and I think what's interesting is that as Hamilton is like a good representation of like a working class city, right? A lot like hard workers, people who care. Resilience is, I think, a key word to describe like the Hamiltonian community. Is there something you see happening in Hamilton right now that you would like to see replicated across all of Ontario or Canada? Like does the city have something that you really think this is something we're doing so right, and this needs to be in other places?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's not a policy. It's what is happening in our movement. We have a coalition of very unlikely partners who have been organizing together for the last 10 or 15 years. That is, the bedrock is labor, the Hamilton District Labor Council. The steelworkers are a big part of our labor story. They're not our entire labor story. Like, we have so many incredible unions that are here. But it's a place where you can have, steelworkers and Environment Hamilton sitting together. You can have Acorn and Disability Justice Network of Ontario working together, on things like payday loans or on rent evictions. You have academics and activists. You have everyday people, regular folks, Frank, who are engaging in civic, provincial, and federal politics to ensure, to the best of their abilities, that their politics are reflected. That comes with tension. There is tension between establishment partisan politics or establishment business interests, whether it's the chamber folks or developers or whoever. But ultimately, when our backs are against the wall in Hamilton, we recognize, to your earlier point, where power is, and that is in a collective coalition that is willing to do direct action to mobilize people. And I think
Yeah,
that roadmap for us should be looked at across the country for people who feel isolated, afraid, and politically estranged. They need to start reaching out into their communities and find where they find people who share their values.
and I really do like that worldview. And one thing that you mentioned is you talked about payday loans. Hamilton was a leader on uh, regulation of payday loans. Is that correct?
I mean, this is where I get to toot my horn. That was my project. Like we took on Stan Keyes and the Hamilton Payday Loan Association, because you talk about those moments where you're radicalized. In 2014, when I had my campaign election, when I had my campaign office on King Street, across the street was a payday loan company. And about the third week of every month, I'd see the lineup, because I campaigned for like 8, 9 months. I would see the lineup down the street of people waiting to cash not their paychecks, Frank, their ODSP, their Ontario Works. We legislate people into poverty. It is a form of economic violence that we don't give people enough to survive on, that they have to take their supports, which are taxpayer supports, and go to a payday loan company in order to get into this spiral of debt. We took them on, we regulated them, we mothballed them so that they're grandfathered them so they couldn't have new ones spread out. But at one time in Hamilton, there were more payday loan centers than there were Tim Hortons. And we're also the home of
Yeah.
Tim Hortons, by the way. So that's a lot of Tim Hortons, right? That's a lot of payday
Yeah.
loans. We shut it down. But again, when we're looking at these things, and you would know this as a teacher, you can't just look at the symptoms. Payday loans are the symptoms from a predatory banking class, which doesn't offer basic banking services to all Canadians. It's a cartel, remember? Fixed industry, very high barriers to entry. You're not getting in unless you're one of the big five. They all left, and with them, refused to give basic banking to people, forced them into payday loans, which is why, for me, I just recently submitted to the industrial inquiry for Canada Post, again, supporting postal banking. There are socialized solutions to almost every single capitalistic or parasitic, or in this case, economically violent and extortionary symptom of capitalism, which is payday loans. But there's many, many other tools that we could be creative with that retain the common good and use the government's power to level the playing field for everyday people.
It drives me insane when people say, "Oh, Canada Post loses money." Well, first of all, it's a service, so like we don't lose money in healthcare. You don't say that when a police officer is doing their job that they are losing money. When a firefighter is putting out fire, they're not losing money. That's not how services work. But on top of that, when we talk about like what can be done with Canada Post, yeah, like if we were just a little more creative, if we were just a little more inspired, maybe we could do something that would be economically beneficial and wouldn't result in losses, but would instead result in net economic benefits that people can see, because people don't see the net economic benefit of Canada Post, even though it exists. And so finding ways
And postal
to
banking, by
utilize.
the way, is well within their mandate, Frank.
Yep.
It's not like look around the
Well,
world.
didn't they used to? Didn't they used to be involved
They
in
have the
banking?
ability to do it. It's in their charter,
Yeah.
but it happens all over Europe. Like, these are not radical ideas. These are not pie in the sky ideas. There's no reason why. And by the way, more post offices than Tim Hortons, once again. This is northern rural banking, indigenous banking. Everybody in this country, I think everybody would agree, needs to have access to a bank. If you don't, you simply have not just a difficult time, it's almost impossible to exist in this society without a bank. We can use that. We can harness the distribution of the letter carriers for the social good. We can deliver community power that way. And the other thing that I would say, when they say that it's losing money, it's very important for people to look at what the actual costs were for those losses. Those were capital costs. Those were building massive depots and buying entire new fleets of cars. Those weren't labor costs, right? Like, there's actually tremendous value in what the postal workers are delivering. Now, you put that against Amazon, which is a gig economy. People are having to piss in bottles to get through. It's predatory. They're saying they're
Yeah,
not
not great
employees.
conditions.
Yeah, and they're union busters. What if
Yeah.
we took our logistics as a national interest and had Canada Post be able to deliver those types of services in a way that allowed for our goods to flow across, not just um, uh, across our cities, but our provinces and internationally, right? So there's so many ways that we can rethink and reimagine the economy that don't leave people out.
Um, I want to kind of, as we kind of get closer to winding down, I want to kind of bring it back to you a bit. Um, I I'm hesitant to bring it up only because I know that for some people, talking about like their personal identity is like really core to who they are, and for other people, it doesn't really matter. So, if you don't want to talk about it, like no worries. But like, do you find that like growing up as a Black Canadian was that really core and central to like developing you into who you are as you are today, or was it just like because for some people it's just like yeah like that's just who I am, and it didn't their identity didn't really uh, impact their politics too much. So kind of where do you fall on that spectrum?
Yeah, it is a core piece of who I am. I grew up, going to Emancipation Day picnics in Owen Sound, understanding that my people like freed themselves from slavery, literally, the footpaths of the Underground Railroad, following the North Star to this land. Like in so many ways, my ancestors are the first refugees of these lands. So immediately, you talked about the waves of immigration that came after World War I, World War II, the Europeans, the Italians, the Portuguese, the Poles, and we have Ukrainians. We've had again, every single refugee that I see reach this land, I feel an obligation to. I feel a kindred spirit to. When things get tough for me and I think about ways in which there are barriers in my life, I think about what my ancestors had to go through, right? What they persevered for. That gives me the drive to keep pushing. But I would also say that I don't view identity politics um, as a way that divides us. I actually view it as a way that allows me to acknowledge other people's struggles, even if they're not mine, even if they're not specifically mine, even if I don't have their lifestyle or their God or their language, or if I'm from their culture, I can acknowledge the humanity that they have. And I think growing up, as a racialized person in this country, those things should be built into you. Now, that's not to say that's true. Like not all skin folk are kinfolk. I recognize there's a variety of different ideologies within the Black communities, plural. It's one of the most diverse cultural groups, ethnocultural demographics in this country. There are,
Because even within Canada, you have like there are like Black Canadians who find their roots in the American South. There are Black Canadians who find their roots in Caribbean slavery, and there are Black Canadians who find their roots in modern day Africa. And so, like when people like identify as Black in Canada, it is a much more of a cultural mosaic than I think people give it credit for. Like Black is not a singular identity, right? Like
no, no, but for me, and again, my mother is from a very rural, white European, Eastern Ontario upbringing. Shout out to South Mountain. Had a cheese factory. Like I would grow up going to my grandparents' house in South Mountain and being in the country and feeling comfortable there. And so, in a lot of ways, while being racialized in this country, identifies you as being Black, in so much as the ways in which you're attacked and so on and so forth. It is also true that I'm comfortable in any setting, um, but that is not my. I wouldn't say that's my defining feature. Like I would say my defining identity is growing up in a working class city that saw struggle firsthand across all races, right? Like there's a lot of white folks living in deep poverty here, a lot. And what right wing populism does is it points its finger at the other person and says it's their fault. It divides us and pits us. Forget about, they use this idea, oh, it's woke, it's this or that. Like that's just code word, right? Like the true identity politics is on the far right, who will use every single thing to divide us, right? And it's our aspiration as a country. I truly believe that Canada can be a place that is truly multicultural, that respects coexistence. I don't expect people to have to adopt or condone or whatever somebody else's lifestyle, but they have to respect their right for coexistence without interference from the government or other religious institutions or ideologies.
Yeah, no, you kind of really struck a chord there. And actually, I'm in the process of scripting out a video about like how a lot of Canadians don't view themselves as settlers and they don't really understand um, like the empathetic side of why we have to use that kind of language. And I think I might send you a message about this later when I'm working on it.
I would
Just
love that,
because,
bro. Like
yeah,
you look at Hamilton, like you talked about immigration, those waves. We have a train station, which right now is Leuna Station, downtown Hamilton. We had generations of Europeans who came to Canada, and when they arrived here, Frank, they were not considered white. Unless you were a WASP, you were not considered white. If you were Italian, Portuguese, if you were Slavic, if you were Polish, whatever, you weren't considered white. Jewish folks were not considered white here. Like Irish folks, in a lot of ways, weren't considered white when they first arrived here. And so even that concept of whiteness and who is and who isn't has evolved and changed as a social construct
yeah,
over the last few years.
I feel like especially Italians, like I grew up in a very Italian area. I grew up in Woodbridge, and like so many people identified as being white. And I'm like, have you not spoken to your grandparents or your aunts and uncles? Like, do you not know the type of racism they faced? And so I think that's like at a very young age, I was never vocally anti-racist until I kind of learned the language in university and understood the importance of being anti-racist. But I was definitely not an active racist person growing up,
Right.
specifically because I heard the stories. Like, why would I want to wish that upon anybody else? Why would I take the harm that has come to my parents and my grandparents and then put that trauma onto somebody else just because they're a little less white than I am? Like a nebulous concept as white. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. No, for sure, man. I appreciate that. And like I think my hope is like where I find my optimism in these times of despair, conversations like this, like our ability to connect now, see people for who they are, like see their humanity, see the humanity in other people, connect with them, organize, have these discussions, have a deliberation. Like, by the way, when I say I'm a socialist, I'm a democratic socialist. I am okay for people to not agree with what I say. I'm okay with that. As long as the caveat being, as long as it doesn't question someone's humanity, as long as it doesn't question their right to exist, we can disagree on tax policy or fiscal policy or social policy to some extent, and we can still love one another. But when it comes to that point where the disagreement is based in someone's right to exist, that for me is where the discourse stops.
Yeah, like there's no argument to be had about whether or not somebody deserves to be alive and be respected. Like
Not at all.
that's a basic human right. One thing that I wanted to leave off to like a last little question, a little bit more of a fun one. We talked about the different types of people who came into Hamilton, and so there's a lot of like rich cultural diversity when you look at a city, and with a city like that, that means that you usually have good food,
We have great food.
right? And that's so like where I live right now, I feel like the cultural diversity, there's a lot of, the city has become more diverse in recent years, but because it wasn't historically diverse, the food scene's a little weak. Like coming from Vaughan, the food scene was on point, and I missed that. But in Hamilton, is there, like for me, it's shawarma. Like my diaspora food is like, if I was to look at another group of people who like, I appreciate the food they brought here. I love Mediterranean, Middle Eastern food. What's your like specifically like outside of your own personal upbringing, like what's your like cultural food that you're like, oh, I'm so glad that they're in Canada so I can eat this meal?
Yeah, I also love Middle Eastern food, Mediterranean food as well. But I spend a lot of time in Ottawa, and Ottawa's shawarma game is next level. So like it's a tough one. It's not to say that there isn't good restaurants here. There are, but I would say there's a big pizza culture. Like there are these boutique pizza places that are popping up. That seems to be pretty good. There's lots of small independent restaurants that are popping up, and obviously the pho is on point here. We have great Italian food. We have this little house around the corner from my house called Giuseppe's that literally looks like a house. And when you walk in, it feels like you're in somebody's living room. And quite literally, like there's, two Italian guys in the back. One guy takes your order, the other guy cooks it up. It's delicious. We have lots of really good Italian food in Hamilton. You do. My spouse and I were talking about this because I had the privilege of traveling quite a bit in my younger years. And she's like, you were in Italy. What was the pasta like? I'm like, my mother worked in an Italian banquet hall. So the nonnas would send home pasta all the time. And I can't say that Italy's pasta was better than the nonna's pasta that I had, from the banquet hall my mom worked at. When I was in Greece, same thing. Like, obviously their food tends to be a little bit fresher and stuff, but I think that multicultural tapestry that you talked about is alive and well here. Eastern African food too. You know what I mean? Like I'm loving Ethiopian food,
I was gonna say there's been a
Somali
big spike in
food.
Ethiopian restaurants, and it's been
Yeah,
like banging. It's
Watts
good
is
stuff.
here. We have Somali food coming through. Chard, like this is a good example. We have I believe it's a Jewish owned chard, which would be like kind of the piri piri, like a Portuguese
Yeah.
African chicken on the rotisseries. Oh, to die for. They had a fire. Hopefully they're going to open up soon. But yeah, great food. You can get pastage de nuts. You have the Italian bakeries. You got it all here. It's a great city.
And you know what? I think that's a good thing for people. You talked about people coming into the city and the issues with gentrification, but I think that the one thing that irks me with gentrification is when you lose the heart and soul of those restaurants, because like the housing is always going to get more expensive. It shouldn't, but it does, and we have to fight that. But when we lose that cultural touchstones of what makes a city who it is, it's the people, and the people own those local businesses, and those local
Totally.
businesses employ local people, and that the food is at the heart of that. At least that's how I like to view it, right? So
There's a storied rap artist, an anarchist rapper named Lee Reed, who has a whole song about the price of tacos in Hamilton. Shout out to Latin food products in the farmers market who sells authentic, tacos. But there are hipster tacos here that are like probably $15 a pop. So it's this is the economics that we're in right now, and
if
you
it's a good
know
taco, I'm paying for it. I'm going to eat it.
fair enough. Well, that could be the challenge. Whenever you want to go live to air, I let me be the first to invite you to Hamilton, and we'll do a
Get some
food
tacos.
crawl. We can sample the little selections, and you can rate them, and it could be a whole thing.
That sounds good. I appreciate it. And then thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate this.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me on. And I just gonna say you're an educator. You're an educator in the classroom. I watch your content. There are some things that I think challenge the way that I view things, but that's great. We need that space. But I do appreciate the effort that you're putting in as just an everyday person who stepped up in a time during COVID on social media to provide this type of information. I run a program, we call Parliament to the People. I view this as being very similar and along the same lines. So shout out to you for doing this popular education work. I know it's not easy. I know it's thankless and it comes with all types of criticism, but please do continue.
I appreciate that very much. Thank you.
Yeah, man.
Have a great one.